welcome everybody. I want to start our evening. I'm going to make a few brief comments and then we're going to launch right in because we know you're not here to listen to me talk. You're here to participate in what I anticipate being a very powerful evening and a robust conversation. So welcome tonight. Thank you very much for being here. My name's Jennifer Treppa. I am part of the NIOT Novato committee that's working here in Novato to, officially to make Novato a Gold Star city of inclusion, safety, and equity for all of its residents. And we have some information out at the table. I encourage you before you leave to look at it. And it clearly outlines what the official Gold Star City efforts entail. It's exciting. It's an exciting time for Novato. I applaud the City Council. It was Mayor Lucan who is here, and you'll hear from him shortly, who brought the idea of having Novato be a Gold Star City to the council agenda. And I'm very proud of our council. They voted unanimously to support that effort, as did the school district. We're really fortunate that we have a collaboration of our city, our school district, and our police department. Chief McGill is in the back. He's on the steering committee of NIOT Novato, as well as a lot of community members who are coming together to do this work in our community. And I'm really hopeful that we'll add some of you to this effort, because making Novato a safe and inclusive community for all of its residents across all of the different fault lines that we navigate is the goal of NIOT Novato, and it's going to take all of us to do it. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mayor Lucan to come up. He can speak more directly about what the city is, the city's commitment is. Oh wait, I'm sorry. But before I do that, because you don't have this nice little card to introduce our presenters, so I will do that. You're going to hear tonight, our facilitators tonight are Laura Eberly and Miguel Galvedon. They're going to lead us through the process of learning about and discussing and exploring the concepts of implicit biases, which that can be a challenging process. How many of you were able to take the implicit bias test that was on the flyer before tonight? Great. Eye-opening, right? Okay, so we'll hear more about that tonight, and that's going to be one of our community asks after this conversation, is that you go and take it on your own time after tonight, and it might put some of the conversation that you hear tonight in a very personal context when you've done that. So Laura Eberly, she is the Director of Social Change for San Francisco and Marin, the YWCA. She leads the YWCA's Inclusion Inventory. DEA stands for? Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, of course. Consulting program, as well as the YWCA's legislative and coalition advocacy. She comes to the work with extensive experience in leadership development and community organizing, and she has a degree in public policy. Miguel Galvedon is a leadership and nonprofit consultant. I saw him talking to many of you, so he's no stranger to the group. He's currently the chair of Marin Community Foundation. Is that correct? Or you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, yes. For tonight. And has been a volunteer for the Marin County Juvenile Probation Department's Disproportionate Minority Contact Initiative since 2012. And Miguel is currently working on a number of initiatives throughout the county focused on supporting our targeted immigrant population. So thank you both for being here and leading us in this important work. And now, Mayor Lucan, sorry about that.
Oh, well, thank you, Jennifer. It's my pleasure, my privilege on behalf of the entire City Council to welcome everybody here tonight. As Jennifer mentioned, yes, the embracing Not in Our Town and Not in Our Town Novato and keeping the conversation going so that Novato will be a safe and inclusive community is something that our entire council is unanimously and enthusiastically behind. And I remember I was introduced to Not in Our Town several years ago, but Novato has a long history with Not in Our Town, and we held a couple screenings, a couple of events, and what's so encouraging to me is that we know we don't create a safe and inclusive community by just having a screening or having an event. Those are really just the gathering points and the conversations that continue afterwards. And I'm so excited to see that Not in Our Town Novato has formed. There's a committee. We are keeping the conversation going. This isn't something we just check off a box or a task that we complete. It's an ongoing conversation. And that's why I'm so excited so many people are here tonight on a Wednesday to keep the conversation going here in Novato to make our community a better place. So give all yourselves a hand for being here. This is just the start, and we're excited for what's happening in Novato and the partnerships that are happening here. So welcome tonight.
All right. How's everybody feeling? Good. So thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Laura Eberly, and I work for your local YWCA. Our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. And that means that I have the great honor of getting to have these kinds of conversations all the time. I get to step in and out of communities who are really invested in doing deep work on themselves and on the world at the same time, and trying to figure out how we can create spaces that everyone can be a part of, can bring our full selves to the table, and be equitably heard in those spaces. So I'm really touched and honored that you all are here tonight, and to get to have this conversation tonight with you. I'm going to ask you to enter into this in that same spirit, that we're going to try on some uncomfortable things. We're going to try and go a little deep and have some vulnerability, right? Some of these topics are things that we can be really defensive about, or at least that I can be really defensive about. I'll speak for myself. It's always hard to hear if you might have misstepped, if you might have done some harm in some space or in some way, or even just something that you didn't know about. That can often be really hard to hear. So I'm going to ask you all to be really generous with yourselves first, and then with everyone else who's in the room tonight. That we're all here in the spirit of learning something, and that we're going to then go out into the world and try and do better than when we came in. Is that something that folks can agree to right now? Yes. Okay, cool, thank you. So Miguel and I are both going to talk a little bit, and we're going to show a couple of video clips for you all to think about and respond to. But first I want you to know who you're sitting with. So if you can cluster together in groups of sort of 3 or 4, however many people you can easily hear, and then I'm going to give you 3 questions to answer with that group. I'm going to ask you to listen intently to what everyone in your group has to say, allow people the space to speak, right, without giving them advice or critique. And we're just going to get to hear a little bit from your neighbors next to you. So the first question that I want you to answer with the folks around you is, what is something that people get wrong about you? It can be strangers out in the world, people at work, your family members, anybody. What is something that people commonly get wrong about you? Go ahead. Let's see it. All right, raise your hand if everyone in your group has gotten a chance to share. Most. All right, come on back together. Oh, you can stay where you're sitting, but I'm going to give you your second question. Okay. Are you guys going to make me go high schoolers on you? I can make you clap once if you hear me. All right. So your second question is related. You're going to share with the same group of people. This question is related. It's, what do you wish people understood about you? What do you wish that people understood about who you are?
Okay.
So should I?
Graduation, hopefully then I'll get a job. And that'd be so
That's awesome. All right, come on back together. I have one last question for you. All right, so the last question that you're going to answer with your group is, what is something that you have gotten wrong about someone else? So we all have experiences of someone getting something wrong about us, and that probably means we're getting something wrong about other people sometimes too. So what's a time that you've gotten something wrong about someone else? All right, and come on back together, please. Great. Thank you. So we use those questions to frame a conversation about implicit bias because the whole point of implicit bias is that it's something that we don't intend, right? Implicit bias is a bias that is, by definition, unconscious or subconscious. So something that we assume about somebody that is inaccurate, but that we don't intend. So the assumption going into a conversation about implicit bias, and a whole bunch of people who chose to be here on a Wednesday night when they could be doing anything else, is that most people in this room are not trying to be prejudiced or not holding active intentional prejudice against anybody, right? And yet, we're all part of a society where we all receive all kinds of messaging and all kinds of conditioning from the inequities that actually exist in the world to the messages that we get online and in the news media and in our television and the other things that we consume, right? And those messages shape us. They shape how we think about the world and the assumptions that we make. So implicit bias is a sneaky thing that gets into our brains, and we may not know that it's there. And we may even not want it there. And it can still influence how we act in the world, the decisions that we make and the assumptions that we make. And I think it's important to note that more than just a like or a dislike of a particular group of people, implicit bias often shows up in an association or a story that we tell ourselves about a certain group of people or about the world. So if I say to you, picture a firefighter, or picture a nurse, picture a janitor, picture a lawyer, you might have certain demographics that come immediately to mind. Based on your actual experiences and based on the messaging that you see around you, that firefighters are supposed to be men, nurses are supposed to be women, janitors are supposed to be people of color, lawyers are supposed to be white and wear a suit, right? And depending on your own experiences, like you may have actually spent a lot of time in nursing or around nurses and met many male nurses, and you might quickly correct that picture, or your picture that automatically comes up might actually be a male nurse, right? But for most of us, the instant assumptions and associations come from this broader social context that we're in, unless we've had direct experiences to counteract it, and unless we've done some work on ourselves to say, why is that the picture that comes to mind? And in an exercise like what I just did, like it's just, that doesn't have a lot of import or a lot of meaning. It doesn't have a lot of impact on people. But over time, it does, right? And when people make quick snap judgments in life or death situations, or in hiring situations, or in determining who's going to have access to housing, to jobs, to education, and the stories we tell ourselves about how someone behaves. You know, is a child bossy or assertive? Is a child sassy and talking back, or self-expressive? Right? So we tell ourselves stories, and particularly if we're not aware of our own implicit biases, we won't realize that we're interpreting the world through them and telling ourselves stories to make the world conform to that bias that's in the back of our mind that we're not paying attention to. So that's why this stuff really matters, and it adds up to systemic inequities, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So we're going to show a quick video about stereotype and bias. This video is in particular about how they can show up in the workplace. It was produced by Facebook. Facebook actually has a pretty good curriculum that they put their own employees through, and it's open source. So you can go online and watch these modules. There are more of them, and I recommend them all to you. But we're going to watch one. And as you're watching, I invite you to have this question in mind of where might this show up in your life, and what does it take to undo or address bias? So what are some of the things you hear in this video that tell us about what we can do to address bias when we notice it? All right.
I think we all understand from our daily lives what a stereotype is, but I don't think that we spend a lot of time to internalize how dangerous the application of stereotypes is. So there's good news and bad news, right? And the bad news is that we apply stereotypes almost automatically. We don't really think about it. The good news is that you can control it once you think about it. And that's where we want to get to. So the danger with stereotypes, I want to take a sort of inspiration from one of my favorite authors, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She says, the problem with stereotypes, and she does a whole great TED Talk about stereotypes. And I'm tweaking her saying a little bit, because what I think the problem with stereotypes is that while some are true, many are not, and all are incomplete. You never get the whole story, even when there's some truth in it. And by the way, there's not always some truth in it. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. This is a country that is famous for people liking to have a good time. The home of carnival, steel band, calypso, soca music, right? We're always having a great time. Woe befall the Trinidadian who doesn't like sun, music, or socializing, right? Don't be awkward in Trinidad. Not a good look. Because you're going against the grain. That's not a stereotype. Come on, you were here to like make the party happen. Now, it's funny when the thing you're going against or what's assumed of your people is something like that, having a good time. So when they're looking for a jester, yeah, they're going to choose you. But it's not so funny when the stereotype that's being applied to you is something that could actually affect your livelihood or your life. Think of many different common stereotypes that you know. I can rattle off lots of them. In the workplace environment, we talk about the fact that if you're from the military, people assume you're really hierarchical, because that's what the military is like. You know, maybe you can't work well in an open environment where we don't have all those levels. And what happens if we judge somebody who's from the military because of being from the military as opposed to because of their own individual characteristics? We run the risk of losing great talent because we've made a judgment. Same thing, Latina women. There's this stereotype that they're really emotional. Hotheads might be a phrase you'll hear. When Sheryl Sandberg teaches this course, she talks about the fact that she cries at work and she admits that. But she says, you know, if I were Latina, I mightn't be so prepared to admit that. Because it would be playing into the stereotype. And I'd be afraid of how people saw me knowing that about me, confirming that stereotype. So if you are Latina and you want to cry or shout, exclaim, whatever, get angry at work, you're more self-conscious about it because you know people already think that about you, they think negatively about that, and then you're more likely to not be your authentic self, to not bring all of yourself to work. And every study shows us too that that's not good. It's not good when you're using energy holding back part of who you are. Hispanic men. There's been so many anecdotes by Hispanic men saying that in the environments in which they work, because they are disproportionately represented in entry-level or manual labor jobs, when they are not in those jobs, people don't assume they're Hispanic. So they'll have situations where somebody's like, oh, I need somebody who speaks Spanish. Let's go to facilities, instead of asking the guy right next to them. These things play out all of the time. The other thing, once you start to appreciate all of these stereotypes that are around, is what stereotype threat does. Stereotype threat is where you run the risk of underperforming because of a stereotype that you know people hold for your group. So it's like you already know that they think you are bad at this, or that you will underperform in relation to your straight, white, male colleagues. And so you get nervous and anxious and end up doing things which are sometimes called self-handicapping behaviors, which could include disengagement, which ultimately means, guess what? You're not performing as well. And I think every human being can tap into what this means for themselves. There's got to be something everybody in this room has been told at some point, you don't do well. Might be speaking a foreign language, or taking driving directions, or public speaking. First time somebody tells you it, you're like, oh, I thought I did kind of well up there, but okay. Next time somebody says it, you're more likely to question yourself. Maybe I do suck. But what if people were consistently saying it about everybody who looked like you? Like, you people are not good at this. And when I say saying it, they don't have to be shouting it from rooftops. We get messages all kinds of ways, right? If that's a commonly held stereotype that's negative about your group, you start internalizing that. Research shows us that. And then it sort of becomes self-fulfilling. So you know what? You start disengaging. I'm not going to take that opportunity to speak publicly at this next company event. When you do that, you're not practicing. When you're not practicing, you're probably not getting better. And the one day you have to do it, you get up there and you bomb and people be like, oh yeah, they're never good at that. Think of other stereotypes in the workplace. Asians, great at math, not great leaders. Our Asian American Pacific Islander group at Facebook once made buttons that said, I may or may not be good at math. And again, like, people can laugh at that. But then when you look at the statistics, across the board, many of these companies, we see Asians well represented at more junior levels. But who's in the leadership? Who's in the C-suite? Not so much. And there's a gap, right? Because it doesn't kind of make sense. And one has to think, is that gap being created because of presumptions we have about who a leader is, what style a leader has? These are all the things that we have to check ourselves on. Black women, confidence equals anger. If you speak too loud, if you seem too assertive, if you're too worked up about something, all of a sudden you're that angry black woman. Young people, smarter, quicker to get to things. If that's the message you're sending out, what happens to the people who are experienced? How are they feeling? How are they showing up to work? If they think that people think, they won't get it quickly. Over and over, we see the way stereotypes and stereotype threat plays out. So as we think about biases, we're going to go through a couple of different biases in the workplace. I want you to keep those things in mind. What is the impact of these very, very prevalent biases? And how do we all lose out when we're not conscious and trying to counteract? Performance bias. The way this plays out is people in dominant or in groups, in those more powerful groups, they are judged on potential. People in less dominant or out groups are judged on their accomplishments, right? So you see what's happening going into it. Some people are assumed they're going to be much better. Other people, you're going to have to prove to me that you're good. We talk all the time about being blind, right? No, I'm gender blind. I just see my colleagues. I'm race blind, sexual orientation, height, whatever it is. People presume that they are really very objective. But study after study shows that's not the case. US orchestras, disproportionately male. Till somebody says, you know what, let's do a test. Let's see what would happen if we put a curtain up between the people who are auditioning and the people who are evaluating. What would happen? What do you think happened? many more women were selected. And you think of music as something that has to be very objective. It's either good or it's not. Turns out it's not so. When men are playing the instruments, people perceive it to be much better. When women, not as much. Identical resumes sent out. In substance, nothing is different. One difference. One set of resumes has a typically female name. Another set has a typically male name. Again, I am sure for the people who are evaluating those, they were like, I'm looking for experience and I'm looking for relevance, etc. But what happens is 79% of the applicants with a male name are deemed worthy of hire. And only 49% of those with a female name are deemed so worthy. It's not small impact. It's a great impact. Something as simple or as complex as crawling. Mothers of sons overestimate their boys' crawling ability. Mothers of daughters underestimate their daughters' crawling ability. This example is really great because it underlines what we've been saying, which is that we all own bias. It's not because these are mothers and women that they are going to see their daughters in a greater light. This is something that is all over society. When we're members of it, we own it. It belongs to us. It is our responsibility to do something about it. In-group and out-group people equally. Maybe not in equal measure. I'd have to get an academic to check that for me. But both in-group and out-group people operate with bias. I need to check it. So, what are the findings of all of these studies? Relative to females, male performance is often overestimated. That's why in these gender-blind studies, we often see the results pushing up the numbers of women. This is especially true in traditional fields, like technology that we are in, that are male-dominated. The presumption is that women are not so competent. Same thing happens on race. Two sets of resumes. One has a white-sounding name, one has an African-American sounding name. They're sent out. 50% more likely to get a callback if your name sounded white than if it sounded black. It accounted for 8 years additional experience to have a typically white name. 8 years experience. No one sitting watching those resumes, I think, would have consciously thought of that. But that was what it resulted in. And that's quantity. What if we talked about quality? Another study. Law partners are given a memo. So the memo has all sorts of stuff in it. You're analyzing the law and how it applies to a situation. But the researchers take the time to put mistakes throughout the memo. The same mistakes in every memo. And when they look at what the comments are by the people reviewing these memos, these law partners, when they thought the person writing was white, A, the memo was given a higher rating than when it was black. And B, and really importantly, the way they characterize the person writing it or the nature of the mistakes, they would say, well, I think this guy has potential when the name was white. When the name was black, same content, they would say, basically, I don't know if this person could be successful. I can't believe this person went to NYU, right? The potential, opportunity wasn't granted to them. So this is how doors get shut. And we talk all the time about level playing fields. But you get to realize that when you come down deep into our biases, the playing field is anything but level. So like gender, race impacts our perceptions about an individual, about their competence and their ability. Formal requirements are often applied really assiduously to out-group people, right? No, they have to check all of these boxes. Whereas in-group people, people who you assume to be competent, you're more likely to be loosey-goosey. Yeah, because he'll get it. He can hang. So people kind of free up more. So what do you think is the impact of all of this bias in operation? Give me some ideas. Less opportunity. Opportunity is the critical word here. Because nobody's ever asking for a handout. All people ever want is opportunity. And if we deny opportunity, we're denying ourselves too, right? Because we don't know what people's potential is if they never even have the opportunity to try. What else?
Disengaged, and not that their opinion or their perspective is valued.
And what happens if you feel disengaged and you don't raise your hand often?
Then you will kind of fulfill the perception or the stereotype that people have that you may not be as qualified, as competent, or capable.
Yes. People are less likely to get engaged because the impact is they're not being given the same opportunities. They're held to stricter and higher standards. And then their rate of being hired and promoted is different because it's based on what they've proven, not based on what they're capable of, whereas white men hired and promoted based on potential. Nothing leveling there at all. How do we counteract this? Because this is in part what we're here to do, right? Not just to give you studies, but to talk about what do we do about it. If you believe this research, what then do we do about it? I think the main thing is that we need to be conscious and to check ourselves. Right? If at every gate you're checking yourself, hold on, am I objectively evaluating these people? We're less likely to make those mistakes and to fall into the automatic application bucket, right? So having objective standards and then accountability. Keep yourself accountable by checking yourself and keep others accountable by how are we evaluating? Is it consistent? That's going to weed out some of the human error, as you might say, or that human inclination to rely on the stereotype.
Hi, y'all. Once again, Miguel Gabaldon. Pleasure to join you all today. A couple of comments from the group. What are some key words you heard that made an impact on you? Maybe by show of hands, and we'll just take a couple. Key words you heard that resonated with you, please. Opportunity. Any other keywords, please?
Potential.
Potential. Unconscious. Fantastic. The key word or phrase for me is authentic self. And as Laura invited us earlier, to be vulnerable. So I'm going to attempt that right here in real time. There are precious few people of color, to take but one example of marginalized communities. Of course, there are many. But to focus on race for a moment, there are precious few people of color working in Marin County in civic engagement, in government, and services and whatnot. And I will not dare to speak on our behalf, but I will share a little bit about my own journey in Marin, and that may or may not be applicable to other folks, other kindred spirits, if you will. So where I came from earlier today, my day job is that of a consultant. So I facilitate meetings, coach, work like that. Was in an all people of color space in East Oakland. And usually I'll have an Oakland day or a Mountain View day or a Marin day. And this is one of those rare, unique days where I have a Marin and an East Oakland day. So there's a transition that happens within me, even on the way here, where there is some anxiety. And given that we were going to talk about implicit bias and structural racism and stereotypes, I was like, oh my goodness, why did I say yes to Nancy? Because there is a vulnerability with that. I wonder what people are going to think and feel. Whereas when I am in a space that is predominantly people of color, that anxiety melts away. If anything, I am more my authentic self. So I'm going to take a little risk here. I want to tell two stories, and I'm hoping that these stories are helpful into what folks might consider doing or not doing. The first story is easy to tell because it's one of surviving an implicit bias moment. But back then I would have called it racism. More on that in a moment. So this is back in the 90s in Marin, and I was part of an organization that had this long-standing tradition of providing holiday baskets to poor folks. And the vast majority of these poor folks, were brown. At the time, I was working with some young brown folks, and they were signing people up and registering, and they had this brilliant idea of they too wanted to somehow help and participate. They got really excited, and they recruited their parents and other family members to help and participate. So what does the day actually look like? Traditionally, what the holiday basket day looked like is you had white folks from faith communities donating the basket. You had white folks giving the basket to brown people with smiles and hot chocolate and coffee. Beautiful. The intention, and sincerely, I'm not being sarcastic, it's beautiful. It was white folks giving to low-income brown folks. And that was the tradition. It had been there for years. What ended up happening on this particular year is you had the brown youth with their brown adults, family members, getting there a little earlier and moving on things. Now I'm about to hit on a stereotype, and this is what I mean by a risk, okay? So forgive me, but this is my story as I see it, and I still see it to this day. The thing about many brown folks, particularly in this community and particularly at that time, is folks labored a lot. So now I'm going to start saying we. So when many of us work, there's kind of like a hustle to us, and we get things moving, and we move quick, and we go hard. And forgive me, a number of the folks from the faith community did not quite have that kind of hustle. So when you saw 3-4 families come in, and you saw folks from the faith community kind of take their time and get, by then it was like, folks, we were already on it. We already had it done. So what ended up happening is that, again, no sarcasm, these well-intended, big-hearted, privileged, because they were able to give these very generous baskets, were kind of left in the dust on moving on things. So I thought everything was fine and all well and good until I got called in by my boss about this, and I was told that a number of these folks from the faith community were upset about what happened, and they wanted to meet with me. And so we met. And their response was, well, there was nothing, these people didn't leave us anything to do, and there was no point in us being there. So, bear in mind, I was in my late 20s. So at the time, I pulled out racism, and I used that terminology, and I was very defensive. And I talked about how dare you perceive us as being always the poor and the receiving and the needy. How dare you see us this way? Had I known about implicit bias at that time, I would have opened up the conversation about implicit bias and gone there. And that is why I'm really pleased that you all are exploring implicit bias and how that connects to structural racism, because I don't think we can let that go, so easily. The second story I want to tell is when I have perpetrated implicit bias. And it's still an area of exploration I'm engaged in to this day, including when I was in East Oakland not too long ago. So I grew up with a lot of anti-blackness in my family. Our world was pretty much brown and white growing up, and there was a sprinkle of everybody else here and there. But some of the most horrible stereotypes and racist remarks that you can imagine, my family perpetrated them. And I did too, as a child, as an adolescent, as a teen. I went right along with that. That all started changing when I moved to Oakland. And it was the first time I ever, by the way, I'm going to use the term black and African American interchangeably. It is the first time I was neighbors with black folks. I saw, remember in the 90s, so since then things have changed, but anyway, in the 90s in Oakland, there were a number of black-owned businesses, just black folks on the streets. And I'm going to be a little coy here, but it's real. Black folks flirting with me. It's the first time I ever socially engaged with black folks other than dad's black friend at work, in mass. And that just really rocked my world. When family would visit and they would see I was in a black neighborhood, they would trip out. They'd be scared. And I used to be one of them too. Like, oh, no. And then I introduced them to folks. So in my experience, that's how we start undoing implicit bias, is through lived experience. Another big game changer was being part of an organization, used to be based in San Francisco, now they're in Oakland, Equal Justice Society. I haven't kept tabs on their website, but their website may have additional resources on implicit bias. Equal Justice Society, who was founded and is still led by someone named Eva Patterson. an African-American woman who changed my life and challenged my anti-blackness. The first direct challenge that came from her was at this event, where there were a number of lawyers, judges, professors, and it was easily 90% black. And Eva, my boss at the time, was excellent at reading people. Just excellent at many things, but that's one of her gifts, at reading people. And somehow she managed to see in my face, and she tells me, Miguel, this is the first time you've seen this many black folks in suits, huh? This is the first time you've seen this many black professionals in one space, huh? And she said it with a smile, but she said it as a challenge. And I said, yeah. You know, I was embarrassed, but I said, yeah. And that too was a critical moment for me. That's also where first time I got exposed to terms like implicit bias. And that was another gift of working with this organization. Since then, what helps me with implicit bias is not to be colorblind. That doesn't work for me because I am not colorblind. So this is applicable to gender and other folks, other people of color, but in particular, my journey has been a lot around African American folks. So every time I receive a pearl of wisdom from an African American, in my little brain, I try to connect that with, that's right, it was a black woman who taught me this. When I receive generosity, love, unconditional acceptance, or shoulder to cry on, and if that person is black, I sit there and make that personal connection with, that's right, it was so-and-so who is black who did that for me, who gifted me with that. And that is how I've been slowly to, I hope, undo some of that implicit bias. But to be honest with you, when I walk into a space and there is black skin, that will still surface. It just does. When they're a stranger. Once they become someone known and someone I have respect for, it doesn't become colorblind, but again, I start attributing positivity, warmth, generosity, wisdom to folks. Hope that was something helpful. Laura, I think you're up. All right.
Thanks, Miguel. So what about you all? And I think we have a mic that can get run around for folks to share. Where do you see stereotypes and bias playing out in your life? And what would it take to change a bias that you might hold? I see the first hand in the back corner there.
Good evening. Thank you so much for organizing this. I hope we're going to have many of them around the county and many other counties and throughout many states because we need this. And I want to point out a bias. When a person who, in our opinion, being Muslims here, is not a Muslim but does a horrible thing which is terroristic and belongs to ISIS or whatever, the news media immediately says, well, this guy or this woman, because sometimes it's women, belongs to a worldwide organization that has online brainwashing and so on, which is true, unfortunately. But if it is the guy who committed this atrocity that we just saw in Christchurch in New Zealand, he is often depicted, and this is starting to turn. It's been changed now. CNN and many other news organizations have started addressing this. He is referred to as a lone wolf. This guy was not a lone wolf. He is a very dangerous, sick moron who actually went to the White House, had himself photographed in front of the White House with his cap, red cap that says "Make America Great Again," and went online with American websites to get himself brainwashed into murdering people who were mostly immigrants. Doesn't matter really, finally, ultimately, if they were Muslims, he just needed the other immigrants. So I think that when we talk about a bias, that's a big bias right there. Mm-hmm. And we need to change that. And in conclusion, I want to say this. For those of us, I was raised and born in Europe at the end of, 10 years after the end of World War II. We had a very strong impact in our history classes in school when we were children about what had happened. At the age of 9, we saw movies about the opening of the death camps and so on. We were told about this, so in the hope that we wouldn't let it happen again. We don't do that. I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for 25 years in this county, and we do not teach our children about history. There's a great Muslim composer and writer-composer, musician named Zaid Maher, who said, "We forgot to teach our children about history and honor." And that's true. We need to do this. We need to teach them what can happen. The Jewish community with whom we are working is very aware of it. What happened in Pittsburgh is no different than what happened in Christchurch, and it could happen anywhere. So the rise of fascism in the world today is true, it's happening, and the rise of white supremacy is also very true, and it's happening everywhere, especially here. It's never gone away. The black community knows it, the Latinos, we know it, lo sabemos, and the Muslim community and the Jewish community, we know it. So we need to tell everybody about this. We need to make a lot of noise about it. And we need to demand of our political representative that they denounce the president who refuses to denounce white supremacy.
Okay, thank you. So I heard, I'm sorry?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So I heard at least, I think I heard at least 3 prescriptions from you about ways to address bias. And tell me if I have your words correct. I heard that we need to be teaching history both to our children and to all of us, right? Because we may or may not have had great history ourselves as children. I heard that we need to critique media messages, right, that come out about whole groups of people, and in particular about Muslims and immigrants. And I also heard that your Muslim community is working with the Jewish community, and that one of the ways that we need to be building across bias is to find out who our allies in this work are, and to be having those kinds of conversations with each other. Yeah? Okay. So thank you for all of that wisdom. To repeat the question that I asked was, what do you think it would take to undo a bias that you might hold? What are some ways that you can imagine tackling a bias that you know is present for you? Please. We have a mic for you. Yeah.
I have a loud voice. I know one of the ways I did it, I won't say which particular, but from my background, I grew up with people who didn't want me around because of what I was. And they were from, all from the same background. And when I went to work, there was a woman there who was of that background. And I thought to myself, I have to get to know her. So we ended up, I initiated meeting her and talking to her. We ended up going out to lunch together. And I found myself thinking, well, I was hoping that that would mean that I would, view all these other people the same way. It didn't work, but it helped.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so building connections and relationships with people is always important, right? That's always a way to start to give ourselves real examples to counteract stereotype. And it's also rarely enough, right? And we can run the risk of tokenizing people. We can run the risk of saying, oh, I know I have a bias where I don't understand the disability community very well, and so I need to go and make friends with people with disabilities, and then I'm actually using them if I do that in that way. So relationships are important, but we also have to be encountering people as whole people, right? And not just as the stereotype or the bias that we're trying to undo for ourselves. Thank you. Yeah.
I can give you an example of my own life implicit bias. I had been teaching in college for many, many years. And I'm a psychologist and would teach about stress and upset. And for endless years, I would say, and I'm ashamed to say it, when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor. And this Swedler knows, in fact, in the teaching form, when you're rated as to your bias and so forth, I really, honestly, always did well. One of my favorite students, after one of these evaluations came up, and he was not a Japanese student, came to me and said, you know, I rated you very highly on diversity, that sort of thing. But you know, you said Japs. And I said, oh my God, since the Second World War, which is my frame of reference, I'm 83, so I'm very much alive during it, they were Japs. And I bring it into a classroom at college at a very high degree and constantly say that. And I was so embarrassed. And I just wondered if you see what's really the lesson of that. Why did it take 15 to 20 years for, I always said it, for someone to inform me of that?
Thank you. Yeah. And one of the things that I hear and value in your story is that the first time you heard it, your response was not to be defensive, but to say, oh my God, and then to change what you were doing, right? Which is, of course, what we all hope for if that happens, right? If someone calls me on something, I hope and aim for my first response to be, I'm so sorry, and then to actually live out that apology by change, which can be hard, right? It can be really hard, especially if we don't think of ourselves as biased people, which is one of the reasons that it's important for me, at least, to go around saying to myself regularly, I have bias, and my bias gets reinforced. So that then when someone else tells it to me, it's not news, right? I can say, oh, right, you're right, I fell into that, and let me do differently the next time. Yeah. Maybe one or two more? I see you here.
Hi, first I want to say of my own experience coming to Marin County, being born and raised here. Very first experience lasts a long time. So when I went up to a bank, I was trying to do some services transaction, and the teller just simply missed me when I was the immediate person in queue, and saw the person behind me, which is a Caucasian. And back then I didn't know nothing about implicit bias. I just felt very cut off, and I did a little experiment after that, and I brought my husband with me. Next time, I said, do this experiment with me and see if I'm wrong to say that. When I'm on my own, they don't see me, but because my husband is a white, a Caucasian, people start noticing me as an individual. I'm not asked to say I'm so and so, even though I have his last name, might sound white, but see me as who I am, as an individual, a human being first. All of us are human beings. That's what we all recognize. I'm not hoping to change everyone's perception because I don't have that power like the maker. You know, I only can answer for myself. So my undoing is be the change that you want to see in the world. I lead by example, and now I represent different boards in the Marin County, and that's my way to put a voice for those who don't have, and to be the cultural competency side for those who don't have this kind of a bridge. Because it has to begin with ourselves. If not now, when? You know, there's too much hate. And just to share, there's a powerful movie called The Hate You Give. The Hate You Give. It's a very powerful movie if you have a chance to borrow from the local library. It's just very sad, and every time now and again I see it, it just reminds us so much we need to do together. Not as my community, your community, but the global community, our community as one, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, I see. Oh, go ahead. And then I saw one more in the back, and then we'll move to our next piece.
So, very interesting program. Very, very interesting. How many of y'all see that there's only one African American man in this room? And when you see that, what do you think when you see me here, standing before you in marvelous Marin, beautiful Novato? What's your perception immediately? Say, who's that guy? He must be a professor, businessman, or hedge fund person, or, you know, am I right?
This is that attractive William.
Well, implicit bias, great program, not in our town, great program, great committee. But I'm going to share something with you all, and a few points of reference. I'm not even a native Marinite. I'm not even a native Californian. I'm not a native Marinite nor a native Californian. I'm from Mississippi, the land of hardcore, ultimate, deep-rooted racism, bias, segregation to the core. But now I stand before you on March 27, 2019 in Marin County, and we're talking about implicit bias. How far have we come, and how far we need to go? I think it's 60 years later, we still have this very engaging subject. My grandfather always said that you gotta know what you know, but you gotta know what you really know. And I would fair to guess that every one of you in this room know what you really know about who you are, what's on your heart, what the core values that you were given when you were a child, when you were being raised. Not your intellect, not your politics, not your articulation. That's all stuff you learn. It comes out of your head, out of your mouth, and you espouse that when you want to get something done, you want to accomplish something that's going to benefit you or your organization. Well, who are you? That's the question about implicit bias. Who are you in your heart? You know your bias or implicit bias against women, gays, lesbian, African American, Muslim, Indians, Latinos, women, tall, short, skinny, fat, and different. You know. But then you have to ask yourself, who are you when you are in that circle, as Miguel said? When he's in that circle with professional African American women or men, East Oakland versus Marin County. I'm sure he's a totally different person when he's over there. And it's interesting, you all didn't catch what he said. It was an African American woman. Not a Latino woman, not a white woman, not a white man. It was an African American woman that enlightened him to his implicit bias. He was moved to be in a situation where an African American woman looked at him and said, "You're uncomfortable in this situation." So I say this, ask yourselves right now, tomorrow, 15 years from now, as I look around this room, I see that most of the people in here are over 25 years of age. There's not that many young people in this room. And that's something to think about. Who are we going to have this impact of implicit bias? Most of us have lived a beautiful, very engaging, successful life and still living. But guess what? The question is, what message are we going to carry to the rest of the community, to the young people who are not in this room? I'm Otis Bruce Jr. I'm a senior prosecuting attorney, deputy district attorney in Marin County for the past 28 years. My new elected boss is Lori Fragoli. When I came to this county, I didn't have a friend, I had no network, I didn't have family, I didn't know anyone. I'm literally a walk-on Marinite. I chose this county because I saw opportunities that weren't in existence in the rest of the Bay Area. But I also chose this county because coming from the South, My core, who am I? I was raised to challenge life. I was raised to see life as an opportunity no matter where you at. I was raised to look at someone, if there's bias between this lovely lady and she's looking at me like, I don't feel comfortable with this man or whatever, that's her problem. That's not my problem. She needs to check herself at the door, as the lady said on the program, right? You have to check yourself. So if someone has an implicit bias, that's not my problem. That's your problem. It's not my responsibility to educate you to what's in your heart, what you know you need to change. And if we're gonna change, if we're gonna really change Marin County, if we're gonna really change the world, we have to be very sincere and genuine about who we really are and what's in our heart. And understand that we all need each other. We're in a whole different generation now where these type of meetings, we shouldn't be having too many of these meetings. It's kind of like, let's get it done. I need you, you need me, she needs her, I need you. That's real, this day and time. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one concern. The terminologies which we have used over the years, like Islamic terrorism or the Muslim radicals, those have a lot of resonance and it haunts you back. So it's really a time and we really need to clear that clutter basically. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Before I move us on to our next piece, would everyone who just shared a comment please stand? Mr. Bruce, my sister's back there. Sir, if you just shared a comment in that last section, would you please stand? And you up here. Okay. And would the rest of you all please join me in thanking the other teachers who are here with us tonight? Because that's what this takes. Like, I get this job where I get to be a facilitator, but this is community work. So thank you all for everything you just shared. To the point of what are we going to do about it? One of the reasons that we talk about implicit bias because it adds up to bigger things, right? It's a way that we add up to systemic inequities and the decisions that people who hold any kind of power make out of their implicit bias adds up to reinforcing the systemic inequities that already exist. Right? So no one in this room invented patriarchy or racism, I think, right? None of us began that. And yet, if we have any kind of power at all and we act and make decisions out of our implicit bias, then we reinforce those systems, right? And we reinforce their negative impacts. And power can look like holding official positional power, being an elected official, being a police officer, but power can also look like, what do you say to somebody when you see them on the bus? Right? How do you communicate in any kind of message someone's worth to them? Right? How are you interacting with young people, with children, and telling them what they're worth and what you believe their potential is? So we're also going to talk a little bit for the rest of the evening about systemic racism, right? And the ways that that shows up. So how does implicit bias add up to and contribute to systemic racism? And what are some of the ways that we can start undoing and dismantling some of that work? So we have a quick video to introduce by a comedian named Amir Rahman, who's going to talk to us first about reverse racism.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amir. Hey. You get on stage. You make your jokes about white people. You say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun dun dun? Reverse racism. I said, no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism. And I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and then, just for kicks, subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
Marvin, thank you. You've been great. Good night.
Kevin thought it was funny. So I like this video because humor relieves tension, right? These are hard topics to talk about. And this can let us laugh at it for a minute. But it's also pretty deadly serious, right? This is also actually our history that he's telling us about. So what are some of the aspects of how systemic racism works and how it's been reinforced that he lifts up for us? You can just call out. Slavery. What else? War. Poverty.
Self-capitalism.
Capitalism. Self-hatred. Colonization. It's intentional. It's intentional. Yeah. Advertising. So my question was, what aspects of systemic racism does he lift up in this piece?
About what is beautiful, what image is beautiful.
Yeah, standards about what is beautiful, what image is beautiful.
Political power.
Political power, yes.
Economic power.
Economic power. All power. Mhm. Dominance.
Location, like, countries, continents.
Mm-hmm. Locations, continents, geography. Yep. History. Yep. So where do these things connect? How does the systemic racism piece connect with the implicit bias piece? Lest we get stuck in thinking that it's just about being nicer to each other on the day-to-day. How are these two things connected?
The systemic relies on the implicit to maintain itself.
Can you say more?
Well, as long as
use a microphone? I can't hear it.
As long as the capital W, we don't check ourselves and continue to perpetuate, we continue to perpetuate and feed the system. And the systemic biases and racism thrive because we play along.
Please.
One of the ways this works, colonization and so on and so forth, is first you oppress your own people. When you look at what happened in Europe and why Europeans poured out of Europe to go invade, slaughter, murder, occupy, oppress, and it goes on, you look at it and you realize that at home they were treated horrifically. And I mean horrifically. And that is why it's really important for people to understand their own history. So when white folks understand, and Europeans understand their own history and understand what has been done to them, then it's easy for them to understand that they come to a new continent and they perpetrate what has been done to them. This is what they learned. You keep the person who is supposed to be lower, right? To take what they have. So at first, it's you know, we have to check everything we say, do whatever our background, obviously. But it's more complicated than that. You have to look at the origin of everything. And again, the learning and the teaching of history is really important in that matter. Otherwise, it's just very surface. And another thing I want to say is that people often, when people are, they don't want to talk about racism, right? So they're afraid to almost say, well, this person is black, this man comes from Mississippi, it's a whole other culture within this United States. And that's great. We should celebrate it. This gentleman, Miguel, El Hermano aquí, that's another culture within the United States. We're all different cultures within the United States. We're a great melting pot, we're very lucky. The sister over there, she's Jewish. Her people came from Central Europe a long time ago. That's a whole other culture. And we shouldn't start with, oh, we're all equal, we're the same. No, we're not. We are equal, but we're not the same. And we should celebrate our differences instead of being afraid of them. You know what I'm saying?
I do. Thank you. So one of the questions for me that I don't have an answer to and wonder if you all do is, what does this mean for us here in Novato today? We know that on the one hand, we have this heavy history of systemic oppression. And on the other, we have all the messages that we get every day and the subconscious biases that we all hold. And we know what some of the systemic inequities look like here in Marin. Yes? Yeah. I think the people in this room know what a lot of the systemic inequities look like here in Marin. So what are some of the key ways that bias is reinforcing those inequities?
Our housing policy.
Mm-hmm.
Not in my backyard.
Could you spell out what you're actually implying?
I'm talking about the affordable housing issue in this county and the political football that it has been for years in this liberal bastion. We have great disparities in housing. And that's, it goes way, way back. And it's intentional, it was intentional back when it started.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have to be intentional now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and one of the ways that implicit bias shows up sneakily in that conversation, right, is that people have an association of people who are low income and can't afford to live here, right? They have an implicit association of that with race, and they have an implicit, I should stop with the they. Many people, and I included if I do not check myself, have an implicit association of being low income and being a person of color, and also an implicit association of a particular culture that goes along with that. And And so what ends up happening is people oppose affordable housing developments near their own property. Are you turning me up?
Yeah.
Okay. People oppose affordable housing developments near their own property because they have an assumption about who will inhabit those properties. And that may or may not be spoken aloud in various public forums and the comments section in the IJ. But it's a bias that once named, people are often very defensive about, but that often is allowed to persist unnamed. People are often allowed to simply say that they're opposed to affordable housing without that bias that's in there being teased out.
Just say it's traffic.
Right, we say it's about traffic or parking. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. So we recently moved to Novato and have a son and a daughter. And we used to live in San Rafael for the past 6 years. It's been a long time since I have been here. It's been like 18 years in the US, being an immigrant and also an Indian, and also a Muslim counts. So my son is in 6th grade and my daughter is in 2nd grade right now. But when she was in kindergarten, the topic that came up and she was talking to me was, Mom, I wanted to look like the color that other girls are. And she was like, why am I like in this color? So I had to explain to her and then say like color is not very important. Who people are, what they are, that is more important. You cannot choose friends based on color. So this happened in kindergarten. And also with my son, he can tell how other people are behaving or how his peers are behaving with him. But I feel that it all comes from their parents, how they behave, and that's what is being copied by the kids. So whatever it is we are talking about, like implicit bias or whatever politics or whatever it is, whatever is going on in the house, whatever they're taught by the parents going on, that's what is being brought up by the kids. So though we don't have many of the kids who are very young here, I think we should propagate that to our kids to make them learn about diversity here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's a researcher at UC Berkeley who's done some looking at race and prejudice and really tiny infants, like pre-verbal children. And she's published studies where she can determine that children younger than 2 exhibit racial bias. And it's because infants rely so intimately on recognizing their parents' physical reactions to others. Like when you're an infant, your safety is predicated on, does my caregiver feel safe right now? And so they pick up on messages about, does that caregiver get tense around certain people or have a warm and open disposition towards people or be anxious about certain people? And the children will pick that up and mirror it, even before they have any kind of language. And so often parents are nervous to talk about race with their children, right? But it's already part of their lives. It is already part of the messaging that they're picking up. And so if we don't talk about it, then we're just allowing those messages to be shaped by someone else. So I want to talk about, in our last few minutes together, some of the what are we going to do actions that are actually available to us here in Marin. And I imagine that many of you in this room also have things to contribute to this conversation, so please share. Some of the things that are currently happening, some of the work currently being done. So there's a group called SURGE, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. And the Surge Marin chapter, their purpose is to organize white people to show up for racial justice work. They do this in a number of ways. So they have an email list where they send out alerts about protests and events that are happening, but they also do study circles. So they offer book groups and places for white people to work with other white people on specifically racial bias and how it shows up for us. It can be a really good space for white people to process some of that without putting it onto people of color to help us do that work. So I commend them to you. YWCA also does this work on both the interpersonal and the systemic levels at the same time. So we have a consulting program at YWCA where we come and we work with organizations who are trying to figure out their work around equity and inclusion. I think Jennifer mentioned it in my intro. But one of the things we find here is that there are all these really good-hearted organizations in Marin, right? There are all these nonprofits and social service providers and community-minded businesses who say, yeah, like we get it with the values. Diversity and equity are really important to me. And that does not mean that I know how to recruit more diverse hires or deal with implicit bias when it comes up in the workplace or handle conflict. I need concrete tools to deal with this. So YWCA does that. We have a consulting program where we come and help people and organizations figure out what is the concrete work in terms of your policies and practices that could shift here to put those values into more concrete practice. And then we also work at a more systemic level. So we work on legislation and advocacy around policies for racial and gender justice. And you can find all of that on our website and our social media handles. We also have 3 days coming up at the end of April where YWCAs across the country participate in an event called Stand Against Racism. And literally hundreds of YWCAs and partner organizations put on events around race that make sense in their local area. So many will convene community conversations, many will show up to protests. Our YWCA here in San Francisco and Marin is going to offer trainings around immigrant justice work. So how to show up in solidarity for our immigrant brothers and sisters and how to try and shift policy at the state level to protect them against what's going on nationally. So that's some of what we're up to. And then Not in Our Town also has a whole other slate of resources and events and things that are happening. And before they offer it, I want to hear if there are any others that haven't been named that you all are part of and know about. Sorry, any other events, opportunities, resources to plug into doing your own personal work around bias or the work of ending systemic racism, dismantling systemic racism?
I'm with the League of Women Voters, and the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area, 2,500 members, just recently got together. So all of the 20 local leagues are incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their programming. So any of you that are interested in politics, as well as advocacy work and housing issues, transportation, land use, you can work with the League of Women Voters who are taking part in making active change, writing policies on equity and inclusion. So there are many local leagues in Marin, in Sonoma County, Napa County, and San Francisco who are ready to work with you if you'd like to reach out to them.
Thanks, Vita.
A few things. A few things. Other than looking at things in Marin, there are many, many organizations nationwide that can be of great help to anything you want to do. There's just two of them, the ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center. I was very active in this kind of thing before we moved to California. One of the things that I was taught when I was doing that, and that I think people here who are active in these matters of hate and bias and all that, you have to get the word out. You yourself, be a writer. Write lots and lots of letters to the newspapers. Get your name out and say, this is what I believe, and write good letters. Social media, I can't deal with that at all, but I know most people now, yeah. Get these ideas out. The more you get it out, the better. Merchandising, people who advertise know something really, really important. The more you say something, the more people believe it. Therefore, the more you talk about how you think people should be thinking or behaving or whatever, get it out lots and lots, and eventually people will start to believe it.
All right, thank you. Kevin?
I don't know if he needs a mic, but we'll give him one.
I tend to look at things through a political lens, and what that means to me is I look around at Marin County. I see actually a bunch of people I know here from San Rafael, from Larkspur, from Fairfax. And each of these municipalities, every jurisdiction, including our Board of Supervisors, has a bunch of really interesting, I think, enlightened people who are trying to do some of the things that are important to all of us here in this room. And all of them have email aliases, which you write to them and say, hey, good job passing that new resolution, or hey, can you look at doing something about this problem? It's something that we overlook all the time. Here in Nevada, we have a table that's usually right here at every city council meeting, which has printouts of emails that are, well, printed out by the city clerk that have come into the council. And there's like one or two, maybe three every 2 weeks. So write to Novato, write to Larkspur, write to Fairfax, write anywhere you see that there is something to be said, where you show up for racial justice, or you just make your opinion known about what is fair and equitable and supports diversity. You know, use your political power, your political voice by just writing to these gosh darn good people.
Thanks. See over here and in the back.
I think the approach to external social structures is very powerful. And I want to remind everyone that the person-to-person aspect of this is so pivotal. My own journey was that I was raised by a feminist. I went to a Berkeley alternative school. I got to be 45 and I thought I had racism handled. And I began to understand from my own journey that it was something I needed to be aware of the rest of my life. And then I got some training this year where I started to take on the idea of speaking to other white men about these issues and having the difficult conversations with them. And the things that I saw from those conversations, the way their social media changed one person at a time, was so much more powerful than presenting externalities as if they were going to fix it for us. The moment comes when you are willing to share your own biases and then say to someone else, I am no better. I'm not telling you how to be. Here's how my journey has been, and you can join me. And that's the thing that means the most to me in terms of this work, is person to person, meeting people where they are with the compassion of, hey, I'm no better, wherever they are. And I'm liberal, you might even call me a revolutionary. And I've had conversations with people who support the president, and I continue to stay engaged with them. And slowly we're moving them. And I'm moving towards them too in ways. This is the answer. This is connectivity, humble, and then as Mike said earlier, vulnerability, which I'd like to change to availability. Just be willing.
Thank you.
I have 3 points to make, and it started with one, but when other folks started talking, things came to mind. The first is really easy. It answers your question. You said, what is some things that are happening in Marin? And I wanted to let everyone know about Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. They are conducting a fair housing conference, and it's understanding housing segregation, tools to advance access and opportunity. And that leads to my, and that's April 1st. So next week, 9:30 a.m. to 1:30. And if you want to sign up, I think the cost is $10 or something like that. If you want to sign up, come and talk to me after, because I can make sure you can get a ticket before. But that leads to my second point, which is that one of the reasons why I feel segregation and discrimination and implicit bias, which I don't like to call it implicit bias, because I think that we are very conscious of this bias. Then I'll go to my third point. But staying on the second point is that part of the reason why we continue to live in this implicit bias is because you don't, especially in Marin, you're not living amongst other people of color. You need diversity, and housing is so important to that, and affordable housing is important to that, especially because of segregation. I don't know if any of you know this, but there were deeds that said that you cannot sell your home to a person of color. You might have a home right now that has that in your deed. And that tells you that this was organized for it to be this way, and we have to do things in an organized fashion to undo the segregation that has been created that continues to add to the implicit bias. And my third point is, I started to talk about it, which is that this is not implicit bias, it's very conscious. And one of the things that you said, Laura, is that talking about the study where infant children understand the bias and it came from fear. They might tense up, parents might tense up. And I want to get to that fear. That's the thing that I would like people to check, because I don't think that white racists really feel that they are superior to black people or to people of color. If they really felt they were superior, they might want to help them. But I think there's a fear that because of things that were done in the past, that black people are angry and they're going to do something to white people, or there's a fear that just black people are bad people, and you tense up. And that's been perpetuated by the media, and you know, just throughout life, it's just been perpetuated. And I think that that's one thing that we really have checked. So that's my third point, check the fear. And I do that for myself too, because even though I'm black, I still have the same implicit bias or conscious bias that a lot of you do have, because we grow up with it. Just like this young child who's in the kindergarten class is feeling like she needs to look like a certain way. So checking those things every day is the way that I think we move the needle.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if there's anyone that we haven't heard from yet.
Okay, I just want to invite you all to meet your Muslim neighbor. So every Friday night at our mosque, which is located at 154A Hamilton Way, you will know it's a mosque. It's very small, very humble. We have a family night. You can come from 7:30 on. If you like Indian food, that's a good place to come. We have lots of kids. It's very convivial and congenial, and you can just have a good time and meet people you normally wouldn't hang out with. You're invited any Friday night.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to mention something, a couple of things. One is about something that happens to our community, which is Native American people, is we don't have to actually deal with fear so much. We have to deal with indifference. This is huge because that really goes under the radar when we don't even think about people, the marginalized communities, and then they're just off the radar. And then when I go to groups that are even trying to be so inclusive, and I go to a group and they're singing, "This land is our land, this land is your land," however that song goes. And I'm like, wow, they don't even see the original people that were here, the first peoples of this nation. And I don't think that's, they're not meaning to, they just are indifferent. They haven't really thought about it. And it's become normalized for a lot of groups, just to normalize that kind of not seeing them, of invisibilizing them, whoever they might be in our community. So starting to try to be conscious of those groups and who we have just looked over and looked past and the kind of things that come out of our mouth that sound like so inclusive, but they really aren't, because especially in this country, because we really have just forgotten, so many people have forgotten about the Native community. And it's beautiful that it's a melting pot, and that has had a lot of consequences for millions of people in this country, and it still does, because when you celebrate that just without thinking about it, it marginalizes and visibilizes that whole group. And it's not just that people do that to Native Americans. That's like my example, because that's my background, that's my heritage, that's my history. But we do that to all sorts of communities and all sorts of people in this world. So that's what I'm saying.
Thank you. So I saw 2 more hands, and then I have to give it back to NIOT because this is their event. So I saw a hand here and a hand in the back row.
And we want to respect all your time.
Just hearing the word indifference is so touching what you said. So deep, but indifference, but it's from the ignorance. Some of it is just blind ignorance, because we are so programmed to not know things. You know, history is not what happened with the Persian Islamic, the Iranian history of thousands and thousands of years of vibrant culture, just for one little example, big example. You know, and we just don't acknowledge that. And with everything you said, and with the indifference is a calm and sweet way of saying. I mean, ignorance it's not our fault. You know, we've just been blasted with what we've all had. You know, our lives still go on very strongly. And actually, I was sitting here wondering, what are we doing about the children? I mean, what can we do for the children who are coming up? Once we're going to decide whether or not this planet is going to self-destruct at the end of the century, just from the climate, just from what corporations do it. You know, I mean, and so on. But thank you, first of all.
Thank you.
And we have a lot to do.
Okay.
And we can do it.
And one final comment up here. Jennifer, right here.
Yeah, I'm just going to share. The county actually have various trainings on racism and cultural humility, cultural sensitivity. There's a well-known speaker called Kenneth Harvey. We invite him over again and again, and so if you're interested, there's actually, on the county website, sometimes we do, or even flyers, they actually have talks by him and on the race inclusion. And on every third Thursday of the month, we also have a meeting. I'm trying to get a date for you. This one just went by on the 21st. It's called the Equity and Inclusion Consultation Group. A big group of us come together and find ways to help better for the white superior and supervisor and person of color supervisee. So we are trying to find ways to help to hold conversations that are hard and how to be all encompassing. So it's on a third Thursday from 1:30 to 3 o'clock. It's actually at Kerner in the Welcome Center, the Connection Center. It's for your information.
Thank you. All right.
Send it down.
Yeah.
All right, are we on time? We're on time. Unbelievable. Yes, we need the slide now. So, wow. I want to thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to Laura and Miguel for leading us on a journey that we're going to need to continue together. And Nayat Novato, the good news is that's what Nayat Novato has formed to do in Novato, is to do this work and address how the systemic manifestations of biases and racism, et cetera, are impacting us in Novato. It's for us as a community to talk about together and identify together and solve together. So I want to encourage you that I feel very fortunate right now because on the systemic level, we have the superintendent of our schools is at the table. The Board of Trustees for the school district unanimously voted to do this work. The city council in our town unanimously voted to do this work, and we're going to hold them accountable to do it. We have our county DA, Lori Fragoli, is here, and not only is she here, I neglected to say this earlier, I apologize, but she sits at the planning table, the outreach committee, Nayat Novato. She lives here in Novato, and she's doing this work in addition to her very busy schedule. So the commitment at the systemic level in town is encouraging, and we have a lot more to do, and that's where all of you come in. So what can we do going forward? For those of you who have not taken the implicit bias test, it was on the flyer that got you here tonight. I encourage you. It'll take you a little even more deeply into what we did here tonight. And we'd like you to join our work at Nayat Novato. So our next general meeting is on the 15th at the school district room 107. The outreach committee, which is, the kind of the action part of the group, putting these events together. That meeting, the next meeting is on April 1st. We'll be in the police department's community room. We heard about the work that Surge is doing. We're hoping. The phrase I like to use is we're building this ship as we sail it. So there's going to, as this builds momentum, we're going to have more opportunities, but we're hoping to encourage local book clubs. But in the meantime, Surge Marin is hosting a book club that's actually this weekend, on the 30th at the South Novato Library. They have been reading the book White Fragility. We would like people to potentially host small group conversations, and the taking the pledge is another thing you can do. You'll see a lot of materials out there, and most importantly, pay attention, like we talked about, and be mindful. And again, I just want to thank everyone. There was a lot of brave. There's a lot of brave people tonight, and who took risks sharing their journey in front of strangers. And I want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. Thank you for letting us be part of your journey. And for the NIOT committee, some of you are probably going to hate me for this, but I'd love it if you'd put your hand in the air or stand up or wave your arm, something, so we can give you a round of applause for all the work that we're doing on this. We envision that this speaker series concept is going to be a series. We want to continue to have dialogue in the community, and we want to hear from the community about what some issues that might be of interest to you to dive into this work. So come talk to us, and good night. Thank you.